because this is something that is really, really interesting to me. Their social behavior and their communication with each other, arguably presence of language. There are squid who use their color-changing skin to communicate with each other. A lot of it is around mating, so that they're communicating to each other their availability to mate.
Okay.
But there's more than that we see that we don't know what it means. There's lots of examples, people being in the water with animals or getting video of them flashing different color patterns to each other that we just have no idea what they mean.
Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Danna, for coming and joining me. And thank you as well for an early look into your new book. I heard your Google talk. That was how I first came across you, and I was like, this woman, yes. she has so much to say, and she has such a mission. This mission to sort of get people thinking about cephalopods in the same way that we think about dinosaurs, right? So, not look over them as some like squishy things that live far away, but like actually appreciate their history and how it's way more impressive than some reptiles,
Yeah.
So I was instantly hooked, and I was like, yeah, this woman is on a mission. I mean, tell me a little bit about how you decided, like, okay, people need to realize this. How did you first realize it?
Well, the story of how I realized it is it goes way back, because I got into cephalopods, octopuses and squid and cuttlefish, when I was quite young. So at about age 10, I went to an aquarium, the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and my family took me there in California. I grew up in Los Angeles, and I met this octopus. I feel like I actually met this octopus, because that's what happens when you look at an octopus in an aquarium, is it looks right back at you. And it's clearly this two-way interaction. It has these really interested, intelligent eyes looking back at you. It's just a very subjective experience, but I was 10 years old, so all experiences were extremely subjective. And I was just completely fascinated. The whole time we were in the aquarium, I just sat in front of the octopus tank staring at the octopus. And it basically changed my life. We got home, and I started bothering my parents to let me keep a pet octopus, which is a thing you can do. Not the giant ones that they have in aquariums that are like this big, but you can keep little octopuses that are about the size of the palm of your hand. And we had a tropical fish store that I could bike to. It was within biking distance of our house in LA, and they sometimes had octopuses there. And my dad, bless his heart, got into it with me, and he helped me find a saltwater aquarium that was secondhand, that I could afford. I had this American Girls doll that I had saved up for a really long time to buy. It was a very expensive doll at the time, and I sold it to get money to buy my saltwater aquarium to keep my pet octopus in. And so I was clearly just completely gone on these animals, and I kept a pet octopus for a few years, and I learned how to scuba dive. My wonderful father, again, learned with me, because I had to have an adult to dive with, and we went scuba diving every year. And then I decided to keep going. So I ended up getting a bachelor's degree in marine biology and then a PhD in squid biology. So the slight pivot from octopus to squid was like, there was some soul searching there, but I finally arrived at the realization that they're all cephalopods, and they're all fascinating in their own right. And I loved all cephalopods. And then that love really exploded when I started learning about their ancestry. And this realization that so octopuses and squid are what we usually see and think of today in the oceans, but they have a really deep evolutionary history that goes back, as I explained, even before dinosaurs, like basically back to the dawn of animals in the world, when animals were really becoming a thing. Some of the first ones and some of the biggest ones were cephalopods.
That is, so. I mean, we have tales from like fishermen and sailors from hundreds of years ago about cephalopods, giant squids, and the legend of the kraken, right? I mean, why do you think that people have kind of forgotten about that?
Well, I don't know that everybody has. There's certainly There's certainly a lot of love still in certain corners of the internet for krakens and giant squid, and they'll show up in video games and comic books and things. They're sort of like Finding Nemo, and then the sequel Finding Dory had this giant squid as one of the villains, and of course Hank the Octopus as one of the main characters. So I think they do kind of keep coming back into people's attention whenever you sort of notice them. They kind of capture your interest, kind of like what happened to me is I hadn't really thought about octopuses until I saw one in the aquarium, and then it really captured me. And I think they just have this appeal that's at once immediate because they're right there looking at you, and also very alien, very otherworldly. And I think as humans, we love, we've also told stories about aliens since time immemorial, and we love the idea of an intelligence that isn't human. And I think cephalopods really fit that better than anything else that we've found, because we haven't yet found extraterrestrial intelligence or even extraterrestrial life, but they're here on our planet and they're totally different from us. Going way, 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 way back, we share a common ancestor, as we do with all life on Earth, but those common ancestors split so long ago that they have evolved a brain and eyes and motion and everything on a different trajectory. And that's what captures scientists as well about them. It's interesting. It's like the same thing that's really viscerally appealing to just anybody, to a kid, to a businessman. Doesn't matter what you do. You're like, oh, it seems so intelligent and it's so different from me. And scientists are like, yes, exactly. That's why we like them too, because there's so much you can learn from that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the one thing people compare them to aliens, right? They say if there was such a thing, if we were to discover life on Mars, maybe it would look like an octopus, because it's, as you said, that we share some things, but the need to eat food and reproduce and that kind of thing, but so much else works just so very differently. I mean, does it make you think, we try to study their levels of intelligence, right? I mean, how is there going to be a limit to when we can do that, where it goes beyond what we could even really understand?
I think we're already really, the process of trying to study another animal's intelligence really forces you to confront what you think of as intelligence in humans. What does that mean? What sort of tests can you have for it? And even within humans, it's a very fraught topic. The whole idea of an IQ test seems to be very straightforward to a lot of people for a long time. And then people are speaking up now saying, look, there's so much bias inherent in that idea of a test, and here's how it doesn't account for this, and here's how focused it is on this one particular worldview. And so you have all of this stuff within humans, and then you say, okay, well, let's look at non-human animals. And then suddenly you're like, wait, what does it mean to be intelligent? Is it that they can solve puzzles? Is it that they can use tools? I was reading recently about tool use in a lot of different animals, and it goes way back. There have certainly been times when some scientists said humans are the only ones who can use tools. Like, that's what makes us special. But if you actually look at the literature, the ancient Greeks were writing about seeing crows take stones and drop them into pitchers of water to lift the water level up so that it was high enough for them to drink. And so that's clearly tool use. And that goes way, way back. So I think the more open-minded we are, the more we notice things. And then the more kinship you feel, as well as learning a lot about how animals behave and how we think, how they think.
I mean, I find it kind of sad that we have to think that they have this certain level of intelligence to feel connected to them. But I guess it makes sense because of when you were saying that you looked each other in the eye, and that's something that you we can share with them and be on the same playing field. It's like the understanding, and there's some sort of connection there that goes millions, hundreds of millions of years back. What kind of intelligence do we know that they have that we do share? I mean, I think I read in your book about them being able to recognize individual keepers and play tricks on them and that kind of thing, like that.
It is.
That's incredible.
It's so neat. Yeah, it's so wild. And so, yeah, there's plenty of stories if you talk to people who work in aquariums about they'll recognize who it is that comes in and feeds them, and you maybe treat that person differently, come out when they're in there and they'd be hiding otherwise. And that's certainly what I found with the pet octopus that I kept in my room at home, that it would come out of its hiding spot whenever I came into the room because it expected food. They're so cool. And I think one of the things that I really enjoyed about digging in for the book to their evolutionary history was getting a bit of more insight into where that came from, where that complexity of behavior, that ability to recognize and modify, and like it's really the flexible behavior that I think that so resonates with us, because you can think, well, some animals might display a really complicated instinct that's always the same. With a certain input, they'll always behave in a certain way. But octopuses, and to a lesser extent, only because we've studied them less, other cephalopods will be really flexible. And the same individual might behave different ways depending on how it's feeling, or different individuals have different personalities. And all of that stuff seems to have come out of this history of having to compete and escape from vertebrates, which is us and all of our relatives, so fish and whales and all of the vertebrate animals in the sea that came along after cephalopods got started and kind of forced their hand in terms of evolution.
I mean, they go right back. I mean, there's not really much that came before them, right? That isn't sort of like bacteria and that kind of like very simple life. Like are they the first sort of complicated life?
They aren't. No, there's complex life before cephalopods, for sure. But when the Cambrian explosion happened, which was about 540 million years ago, there was a huge increase in diversity of life on Earth. And before that, there were animals. They were mostly very simple. There were sponges. What other animals there were, people are still studying because the fossil record is not very good. They were mostly soft and didn't fossilize very well. Plus, it's just a long time ago. But when this Cambrian explosion happened as a result of changes in the environment and some feedback loops within evolution itself, that's when you get the original members of most of the big groups today. So in addition to mollusks, which are the group that has all of the shellfish, the snails and clams and cephalopods, you also get the earliest echinoderms, which are your sea stars and sea cucumbers and stuff like that, and you get the earliest members of just all of the other animal groups. So they were part of that early explosion. And there are some very, very, very early vertebrates there as well, but they're like little worms. They're very not impressive. Whereas the cephalopods got impressive.
Our ancestors.
It's sort of embarrassing.
How could you speak about them this way?
At the time, they were nothing special. See what we've done today. But the cephalopods got impressive right away. And so that's why I like to think about it very quickly. You know, still 400 and some million years ago, they were the biggest animals in the ocean, which means they were the biggest animals on the planet. Because there's nothing on land at this point except some algae. And they were big. They were like way, way bigger than a person.
That was going to be my question. Like, how much bigger than a person are we talking?
Yeah. We are not entirely sure, of course, because the very largest cephalopod probably did not fossilize and get discovered today. So, they would always have gotten bigger. But the biggest ones that we've seen, they have these long, straight shells. They all had shells back then, something that we didn't really get into yet, but this was before the loss of the shell that led to just squishies like octopuses and squid. And so they all had shells, and they had these long straight shells. This is just a piece of one here.
Ooh.
I don't know if you can see that. I'll sort of move my head out of the way. And so this is a piece of one that would have kept going in this direction and in this direction. And they're called orthocones, which means straight shells. And the longest orthocone of a cephalopod that has been discovered is about as tall as a basketball hoop.
Oh,
sort of
man. Okay.
Comparison that I've come up with. Yeah. And then you'd have some animal hanging out the end of that. Presumably with tentacles, although they're too soft to have fossilized at the time.
So are we sure that they all had shells? How could you tell if there was something alive that didn't?
That is a fantastic question. Right? How would you know? I suppose the simplest question is we don't. It's not 100% for sure. The reason that we think that is because of the subsequent fossil record, is that we have these shelled fossils of straight-shelled cephalopods. We see the evolution of those over millions of years, slightly newer fossils showing how they changed and grew. Some of them curled up, and you end up with these beautiful coiled ammonite shells like this one.
That is what you think of when you think of a fossil, right?
Yes. This is like the iconic fossil, and it's a cephalopod. It's a cephalopod. So I'm just saying they're very, very important. I'm just saying. But the to answer your question about the soft-shelled ones is then we see sort of around the same time that these really iconic ammonites showed up. Ammonites are these coiled ones. We start to see the soft-bodied ones fossilize, and we see them first with shells that are reduced. So shells that are actually brought inside the body so that you can see the impression of the animal's body outside of the shell. And then you see more recently in the fossil record smaller internal shells. And so you actually see the progression of shell loss that happens until you actually does still have an internal shell. It's just very, very reduced. It's not, it's not a hard sort of calcium. Ooh, see that one just came apart into two beautiful pieces. It's supposed to do that. It's fine. No. I'll show you how they fit together later.
Okay.
But this is a little distraction. Okay. Anyway, so they squid have shells that are soft. But still stiff enough. They're sort of like cartilage. They're more like your fingernails, really, is the most similar material. And so we actually see in the fossil record the steps of that shell loss. And there are octopus ancestors as well that had teeny tiny little shells in them that got smaller and smaller, and you see that happen. And so that's why we have this sense that very early on there weren't any without shells, because then later you can see the loss of the shell.
Okay. So why was that a good evolutionary choice to reduce your shell? I mean, that sounds like quite a big deal.
It is a big deal, and it actually seems like maybe a really bad idea.
Yeah.
If there are predators in the ocean, right, you want to have a shell to hide in. What seems to have been advantageous about it, though, was that it gave them more flexibility. This kind of iconic cephalopod trait that once their shell was inside their body, their skin on the outside evolved this amazing camouflage that we see in them today. And so they could start to blend in with the environment. So instead of having to hide in a shell, you could just hide in the kelp or on the sand or wherever, because your skin is matching your environment. And at the same time, it also let them swim more quickly and maneuver better, because you have this big, heavy sort of shell, and it just, you can imagine you have to kind of turn very slowly through the water.
Right, yeah.
Because it's just not especially hydrodynamic. And losing that, they were able to swim more quickly, maneuver more quickly, and also sort of dart into and hide in smaller spaces.
Because they could sort of squish themselves into whatever shape they needed to be.
Yes, yeah, you end up with that. And what we have in octopuses today, where they can go anywhere that their beak fits, because their mouth, their beak, is the only hard part in their body. And so everything else just follows along.
Oh my God. And I suppose as well, it takes quite a lot of energy to build a shell, right? You'd need to put a lot into your diet to contribute to that upkeep.
That's a very, very good point. And so they were able to start growing much faster and getting to the point of having babies much faster, which is, again, an advantage. It's a jump forward, because then you can just spew a whole bunch of babies into the water, and even if a lot of them get eaten, a lot of them survive, and then those ones can grow up more quickly and make more babies. And so it's just sort of keeps you going, which is still a strategy that most cephalopods use today. Is they grow really fast, even the big ones, even giant squid. The estimates are that they only live about 5 years, and then they have thousands or millions of babies.
So this losing the shell allowed them to get a lot bigger again?
Yes! Isn't that interesting? So this size, they seem to have evolved gigantism multiple times. So they did it first when it was such early times that there was no reason for them to need to grow quickly, because everything was going slowly. There were no big predators, there were no fish, there were no whales, there was nothing. They were gigantic in the very early days, and those ones probably grew very slowly because they had to build a giant shell, and that was fine because everything was moving kind of slowly back then. And then over time, the fish evolved, those tiny, horrible little worms, wonderful little worms, evolved into fish, and the fish got bigger, and they got these big jaws that could actually crack shells. And so that drove a lot of early cephalopod evolution. And one of the things that it drove was this coiling that you get. Because a coiled shell is a little bit harder for a predator to grab onto. A lot of them would, I don't know if I have an example here, but a lot of them would develop spines as well to deter predators. And then those coiled shells, those ammonites, were also able to get fairly large. And it might have to do with the way they coiled, that they were able to grow those shells a little bit thinner. They had these very complicated shapes to them, the way they grew and added chambers, and there's some thought that complexity actually made it easier to build that shell, that they could build it more quickly.
Okay.
Partly because it could be a little bit thinner. And so they could so you have the very biggest ammonites, the very biggest coiled cephalopods, are big enough that you could climb into the shell. They're like 2 meters tall, so they're a little bit taller than a person, and then you could just, there aren't any that you are actually allowed to climb into, but, I have a dream someday that we could make a replica.
If anyone deserves it, Danna, it's you.
Thank you very much. Someday we'll make my dream come true. I'll live inside an ammonite shell. And so the ammonites did really well for a while because of that, because they were also able to grow fairly quickly. But they also suffered a lot in mass extinctions. They did get eaten a lot. And so there was this other strategy about the same time of the shell loss that we were talking about. And then the reduced shells, the internal shells, they were getting smaller, less hard, less solid. And then it seems like those animals were able to also get gigantic, so that we have gigantic squid, we have giant squid, giant octopuses, all of the cephalopod giants that we have today. Which itself seems to be related to how quickly they can grow without a shell. And also the fact that they eat anything.
For real?
Pretty
anything.
much.
Yeah, one thing I really wanted to ask you is, like, how come the shell went on the inside? Like, we have jellyfish that have, like, nothing, right?
Yes.
So how come they kept a little something inside?
Oh, it's such a good question. That's so good. It's so good. There's certainly a lot of research still to be done. So that's something that I feel like I should say about all of these questions, is that in 50 years, I'm wondering, like, somebody will read my book and just sort of laugh at it the way we laugh at dinosaur books from the early 1900s, from before we realized that they had feathers, from back when we thought they all lived in swamps, which is, I think, really exciting. I love that I've written a book that can maybe be one of those old books that we laugh at. But for now, it has everything that we know in it.
It would be a timestamp.
Yes, exactly. It has everything I could find out, at least, in it. And that idea of why would they even keep the shell? Isn't it so good to be squishy? Well, some octopuses did go all the way, like full squishy, absolutely no shell whatsoever. But squid and cuttlefish kept it, and it's really advantageous for swimming. And that's why we have an internal skeleton. It's something for our muscles to move against. It helps us move. So, not just swimming. Swimming is good, but walking and all kinds of movement. To have a hard structure for your muscles to push against and move against is really advantageous. You can go faster, you can do more. And squid and cuttlefish are the swimmers. They're sort of the athletes of the modern cephalopod world, and octopuses are the escape artists. So what it comes down to is, like, Michael Phelps needs bones and Houdini really doesn't.
I got you. Yeah, and they can be sort of like, they can direct themselves, I suppose, easier rather than just sort of floating there.
Yeah.
That is so cool. How is it that dinosaurs wouldn't be around today, most likely, right? Because, I mean, I don't know, they're huge. How would they survive?
Well,
whereas like a form of reptile does remain, right? But like with cephalopods, it seems like to a certain extent they're kind of the same then as they have been for a really, really, really long time.
Well, the great secret with dinosaurs, which my children love to remind everybody that they can get their hands on, is that they are still here. They are birds, right? So birds are what evolved from what we think of as dinosaurs. And they are more similar, the more research we do, the more discoveries that people make, they're more similar than we give them credit for. So you look at something, and especially the kinds of birds that we don't often think of, you might look at something like a starling, and it's kind of hard to see it as a dinosaur. But if you look at something like an emu or a cassowary, and it's got these scaly legs and these huge claws, and they run really fast, and they have great murder eyes, and you're just like, oh yeah, that emu is definitely a dinosaur. And so it's an interesting thing to think about, that transition. We say that the dinosaurs aren't around anymore. And I think on a certain level, it's useful to have a word that means those great big giant things like Tyrannosaurus and Triceratops and Brontosaurus that aren't around anymore. So like, I get that. I think that's totally valid. We don't have that sort of linguistic distinction with cephalopods. We don't have a separate really word that means the ammonites and the orthocones and all of those cool, big, weird shells. They're just the shelled cephalopods that went extinct. But the transition, I think, is actually quite similar. And it's really interesting to see what survives and thrives as the world changes. And it was the same big extinction at the end of the Cretaceous that wiped out what we think of as the old dinosaurs, the non-bird dinosaurs, as well as the non-modern cephalopods. So that's when our beautiful, beloved ammonites went extinct at the end of the Cretaceous, as well as a number of other groups. And that is still such an open and interesting question to me. Why? How much of it was just bad luck to do with the way they were built? Were there some, especially with the larger dinosaurs, it does seem to be the case that when there was less food available, they just couldn't make it. There's no way to survive without food, and the loss of food had to do with the impact of the asteroid and the fallout of that in terms of climate change. And in the oceans, there was something similar. Some parts of the food web broke down because of the asteroid impact that affected climate, that affected acidification. And that is probably what took out the ammonites. But it's interesting that it didn't take out everybody. So that we still have the ancestors of squid, the ancestors of octopuses, and nautiluses, which are the only shelled cephalopods we still have today. They made it through.
Right. And I suppose is the same question. Is it a very equal question to why some like tortoises and birds survived that period as well? It's quite the same sort of question. Right.
Just that in some ways there are differences because there's the terrestrial environment and the aquatic environment, and those were affected differently. And in the ocean, there does seem to be a sort of hideout that existed in the deep sea. And those ocean animals that could live in the deep sea were less affected by the changes. And that does seem to have included maybe some of the squid ancestors, maybe some of the others. And there wasn't really anything quite like that on land. I don't know land as well, because I'm an ocean person, so there might well be something that I'm just like, oh, it's on land, it's terrestrial, so who knows. But you were going to ask about size, which is a really interesting question. And I think it's still open. I think it was very much certainly it was very relevant on land, that as the food webs broke down, the smaller you were, the easier it was to find food, for sure.
And maybe, I don't know, hide from the impacts. So in the ocean, the main sort of impacts were acidification, things that are sort of potentially happening in the future now, right?
In fact, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's one of the really interesting things about studying mass extinctions in the past, is there are some parallels with the current mass extinction, what people call the sixth mass extinction that's going on as a result of human impacts on the planet. And yeah, ocean acidification is a big one that they have in common.
Yeah. I mean, you've described them, and I've heard them described as like very flexible and adaptable, right? So they're spread around the world. They live in most oceans, like deep spaces.
Yeah, I would say that there are cephalopods in every ocean and every sea, pretty much at every depth, which is pretty
Very
cool.
cool.
Yeah, they're all over. And they're very abundant. Doesn't mean that every species is abundant. There are certain species that are rare. There are species that are only found in one little location. But as a whole group, you can find a cephalopod pretty much anywhere in the ocean. Not in freshwater at all. There are no lake squid, and not on land. Sadly, there are no tree octopuses. Although there are wonderful stories about
I've
them.
seen on Instagram recently like a few viral videos of like octopuses crawling across beaches, and I was like, this is when I was just starting to look into this, and like I got in contact with you, and I was like,
Yep.
really? And then it turns out no.
They can crawl out of water.
They can a little bit. There's one species, right?
Yeah. Well, most of the near shore ones. So not a deep sea octopus. If you put a deep sea octopus in the tide pools, it's just like it's terrible. But any octopus that lives close to shore, which is quite a number of species, can crawl around out of water because they can hold. It's almost like taking a deep breath. They can hold water inside their body that they can breathe as they're crawling maybe from one tide pool to another. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
There's no fish that can do that, right? I mean, some fish you get flying fish
Well, there
and
are.
that can jump, but like
there's a walking fish too. There's always
something.
There's always going to be something. Nature is so crazy
but
that
still,
way.
like that is so cool.
It's very, very cool.
I wanted to ask you the move from seawater. So hundreds of millions of years ago, some magnificent, wonderful creature, our mama and papa, decided to walk out of the ocean, right, and make land its new home. How did the transition go from ocean to freshwater? If cephalopods can't live in freshwater, that means there's got to be some kind of like evolutionary gap, right?
This is a really, really good question. And so I should say with the idea of the fish that walked out of water, once again, it's something that's got a backbone, so I basically don't know anything about it. Okay. Sorry, it's just whatever. I should probably do a little more research. But when it comes to cephalopods, I have been thinking about this question for a really long time, and I actually just recently solicited input on Twitter about why cephalopods have never gone into fresh water, or on land for that matter. There are a lot of really interesting speculation. Currently, it doesn't seem like anybody knows for sure, because there's always a counterexample. Cephalopods certainly have a lot of skin area. They don't have a shell to hide in. And all of that skin being exposed to fresh water or exposed to air would have to deal with sort of movement across it of water and chemicals, salts especially, and that is something that they might just not be able to deal with. However, there are other animals that do. There are freshwater jellyfish. There aren't any jellyfish on land, but there are slugs on land. And they need to be wet. There aren't any desert slugs that I know of, but there are certainly slugs that can crawl around on dry leaves and live in forests. And so you're like, why? I don't know. And I think one of the possible answers is just they haven't yet. It doesn't mean that they never will, but so far, all of their evolutionary space has been in the ocean, and they've gone in a lot of really interesting directions there.
Yeah.
So That'd be interesting.
Well, our percentage of fresh water on this planet is not exactly growing, so I mean, I can't.
It's true.
And as sea levels
Yeah.
rise, I can't imagine that would be the choice that they make, is to sort of like, oh, let's try land now. But yeah, I guess that's just so impressive that they've colonized so much and survived so long. I mean, how do they just keep hanging on and adapting? Is it, as you were saying earlier, about they don't live that long, so they're able to make changes quite quickly?
Yes, the speed of their generational turnover, essentially, like how fast they grow up and how many babies they have, seems to be a huge part of their success. The combination of getting to adulthood quickly and then reproducing a lot is really valuable. And so, for example, the squid that I studied for my PhD, the Humboldt squid, has this very flexible lifestyle where when I was studying them in the 2007, 8, 9, they were growing quite large. It's a squid that lives off the coast of Mexico, California, Central America, also down into South America off Peru and Chile. And they're known for getting very big. They're even called calamar gigante in Spanish, which means giant squid or jumbo squid. They get to be about 5 or 6 feet long. So about as big as an adult human. And we were catching them that big when I was studying them at that time. Those large squid were maybe 1 year, 2 years old. And the females that we were catching were able to make millions of eggs. And so we found, for the first time during my PhD, we found an egg mass, this giant gelatinous blob in the water that had, we estimated, maybe 500,000 eggs in it, maybe more, all from one mama squid. And that is amazing. You're like, why aren't the oceans just like wall-to-wall squid with that many squid in them? But you have to realize that when they hatch, they're the size of a grain of rice. And so you have 500,000
Right.
teeny tiny squid babies, and most of them just get devoured by other squid half the time, by other fish, by anything that can catch them. But what it means is that the species as a whole has a lot of potential. And when the conditions are good, the population can really grow and take advantage of that. And then what was really interesting is what happened is shortly after I finished my PhD in about 2010, 11, 12, the oceanic conditions changed. There was a lot, the waters got a lot warmer, there were a lot fewer nutrients, and my advisor and the people who were studying them at the time, because I had left the lab and moved on to some other things, they were finding much smaller squid. They were going to the same places to catch squid, and instead of a 5-foot long mature adult squid, they were getting like a 1 foot long, 1 or 2 foot long squid that was also mature. So it was ready to mate and lay eggs. And that flexibility, that flexibility is a result of evolution. It isn't itself really fast evolution. It's not like that species evolved in 4 years to suddenly grow up at a smaller size. But within their genes, they have that flexibility based on millions of years of evolution. And so they can just do that, which is so crazy. And they can
just make that decision.
Yeah, I mean, this sort of connects back to intelligence, which is an interesting thing, is it's not, they don't have a meeting. There's not like a big sort of higher up Humboldt squid executive council that says, this year we shall all mature at size 6 inches because the conditions are bad. It's something that comes out of their genetics based on what they eat when they're babies, what temperatures they experience. So that part is not connected to their nervous system, to their intelligence at all. It's just a different part of their
But
being.
humans do it too, right? We get stunted growth if, say,
Absolutely.
Pregnant women smoke, or you don't have enough nutrients as a child. I guess it's a survival technique.
Yeah.
Subconscious survival technique. Are there a lot of, I mean, it sounds really special. Is that quite rare to be able to do that?
It's more common among invertebrates, animals without a backbone, because their growth and development generally are a lot more flexible. Like a lobster, for example, will just grow and keep growing as long as it's alive. And so a 50-year-old lobster can be a very substantial lobster, and it'll just keep getting bigger the longer that it lives, which is something that lobsters do. But it's not really something that any vertebrate, it's not something, even a giant whale has a limited size. You know, they grow up and they're done growing up, just like a person does. So invertebrates in general tend to be more flexible in that way. But it does seem that even within invertebrates, cephalopods are very, very flexible. And recent work on their genetics seems to indicate that there might be some aspect of their genetic evolution that has led to that flexibility. Which is very exciting. And there's a lot more work that's being done. Like right now, I'm sort of on the edge of my seat for all these papers that are coming out of the labs where they're starting to sequence whole genomes of whole new species of cephalopods and compare them and figure it all out. And if you're into that kind of thing, it's sort of like the next Jurassic Park coming out.
You know what? I read recently in the news that they've just successfully gene edited a squid, right? They took out its pigmentation. Did you see it?
It was so cool.
What? So crazy.
That was so exciting because it was like one of these puzzle pieces that a lot of current cephalopod researchers are trying to put together, because the ideal is to have some cephalopod species that you can raise like a lab rat, where you can have multiple generations in the laboratory. It grows up, it has babies, you keep the babies, they grow up, they can have babies, and then you can have this total view of a species, which is not something that we really have now for any single species, because so many of them, despite how many babies they have, or maybe because of it, they're kind of hard to raise in the lab, because a lot of the babies are really tiny. They really need and they die or they get eaten, and they really need a lot of specific care. And so this particular species that they were able to edit the genes of to knock out a pigmentation gene, which was incredibly cool, that particular species can't be raised yet over multiple generations. So the dream is then you can edit the genes like people can with laboratory rats or with zebrafish or a number of others, or fruit flies, and then see what happens over multiple generations. So I think we'll get there. I think they'll get there.
That is, yeah. Well, it's like you said, in 50 years, when we look back and we're like, of course, that was nothing. Look at what we got now. What I found really like, oh my God, was like there was just this tiny little byline at the bottom of the article that just said, this process could also be applied to human cells as well. And I was like, oh, okay. One, does that mean there are going to be see-through humans walking around in a couple of 100 years? And two, does that mean that this is something that this part of whatever it is, I'm really don't have any idea about how this stuff works, but whatever it is that they're doing has got to be something so to the core and so fundamental that it's something that we share with squid.
And we do share a lot with squid. So they use melanin, which is the same pigment that we use in a lot of both in their ink and in their color changing cells. And they use a lot of the same, what we'd call cellular machinery, which is kind of a fancy word to just mean the way they build their cells and the way their cells build their body. It's a lot of the same proteins and materials. And so it is interesting, even though as I was talking about earlier, our lineages diverged so long ago, 500 million years ago, just like all of the animals on the planet, we share this basic plan. Our cells are built the same way. Our genetics are the same way of using. We all use DNA, we all use RNA, and we all use proteins. And it's really cool because it does mean that even studying something that seems as alien as a squid can inform what we know about ourselves and our own bodies. And to your question of whether it means we'll have see-through humans, there's a lot to unpack there. But I mean, the easy answer is absolutely yes, that will definitely happen. But, that's just me being ridiculous. Who knows? I think that what they meant and what is interesting to do with that is to use the process on human cells so that individual cells can be studied with this technique or with a similar technique that allows you, when say cancer biologists or any sort of medical biologists are looking at individual human cells of your skin, of your heart, of your liver, it can be really useful to be able to change the way parts of those cells look, to visualize what's going on when they're healthy, when they're diseased. And I think that that's the kind of technique that this will be helpful for.
So, I mean, I've heard as well that scientists are using squids to study neurobiology.
Oh,
right?
yes.
So they're using squid brains.
Yeah, and that's a really cool aspect of squid science that goes way, way, way back. It's actually one of the first things that scientists used squid for was neurobiology, figuring out how nerves connect and send and receive signals.
Really? That's what they thought of first?
Well, the reason is that squid, and it connects all the way to the fact that they're the swimmers. They're like the speed demons, the athletes of the cephalopod world. And part of the reason they can do that so fast is they have this giant axon. It means a part of a nerve cell that's absolutely gigantic. You can see it and dissect it out without even needing a microscope. So if you've just got, and not a giant squid, this is an important distinction. Giant squid also have giant axons, but a squid of any size, even a little market squid, like a little calamari squid that you would buy in the market, has a giant axon. And the part of a nerve cell, the long part that reaches from the nuclear nerve cell to connect to another one. And that's what our nerves are made up of. All of our nerves are just bundles of axons. And ours are very small, and you can't see them without a microscope. But squid, even a small squid, like a little calamari squid that's 4 inches long that you would find in the marketplace to cut up for dinner, even that small of a squid has a giant axon inside it that it uses to swim super, super fast. And those giant axons you can see with your naked eyes if you know where to look, and you can dissect them out. And so that's why scientists even, I'm trying to remember when they started this, it was maybe like 200 years ago or so, that these early scientists, these early neurobiologists were able to study nerves because of giant axons in squid. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been able to study them until microscopy techniques got better and until you were able to see smaller stuff.
What made them even think to do that?
That is a fantastic question. And it's something that I'm still digging into because I'm really interested in this story and I don't know all the details of it. But I think that so scientists in general and people who are just interested in animals, naturalists, have been looking at squid along with sea stars and jellyfish and everything for a long time, even more than 200 years ago, going way, way back. Even Aristotle and Pliny were sort of pulling apart marine animals and trying to figure out what they were made of. And so at some point in there, just somebody looking at a dead squid, maybe cutting it up to eat it, because people have been eating squid for a very, very long time. So it might have been part of a culinary adventure, or just a curious naturalist would have noticed this interesting shape. It's sort of a star shape and a long stretching white nerve or an axon that looks like a nerve. And I think at some point they were just like, what is this? What does it do? Pulling it out, comparing it probably to nerves that they had seen in human cadavers, maybe when dissecting them. And this giant squid axon is so easy to get. And squid are so abundant in the Mediterranean where this research was being done that it was just so easy and reliable. And there was also a lot of early research going on the east coast of the United States in the Woods Hole area, where there's still a lot of fantastic research on marine stuff. And so they pulled out these axons and basically used them to figure out how nerves work. There's this combination of chemical and electrical signaling, and how does one affect the other? And one of the reasons, so in addition to being very big, they're not wrapped up in myelin, which is something that does wrap up all of our nerves. Myelination is a really important part of how human brains and vertebrate brains in general develop. It's why kids need to eat a lot of fat, because fat goes into myelinating your nerves and wrapping them up. And wrapping up nerves makes the signal travel faster. It's sort of an insulator. But squid don't have myelin. And in fact, that's why they need this great big gigantic nerve, because they don't have myelin to wrap their nerves in. And so the bigger it is, the faster the signal can travel. It's just this very raw equation. And so they have these great big nerves, and they're easy to study because you don't have to unwrap the myelin, and these great big axons. And so that was how the early research on nerves in general was all done on squid.
So that's why most cephalopods have really big brains, is because they don't have this.
Oh, so that's slightly different. But it's such that you would suggest that is so good. But of course, it can't be simple. Why would it be simple? No. They don't need to have big brains because of that. That is a slightly different evolutionary trajectory, because you can have other, like a slug or a worm or another invertebrate that also doesn't have myelinated nerves, doesn't necessarily have a big brain. They can have very small, just little, what we call ganglia, just little collections of nerves that do what they need them to do. Right, the size of the brain and the complexity of it evolved specifically in cephalopods for reasons that are still being teased apart, but probably have to do with the complexity of their soft bodies, with all of the arms and all of the suction cups and all of the skin. They have such a complex sort of canvas to put their to work with, that the more complex the nervous system to control it, the more they could do. And so something like a slug doesn't change its color. It doesn't have 8 arms that it has to coordinate all at once to try to do what it needs to do. But a cephalopod does have this very complicated body and a very complicated brain to make use of it.
Right.
In a sense.
I mean, that's one big fun fact about octopuses and the like, is that they have brains in their tentacles, right?
Yes, it's so good. It's so good.
I can't believe we got this far into the podcast without mentioning that.
It's because there's too many wonderful things. It's hard to fit them all in. But yes, so they have ganglia, we call them in scientific terms. But yes, big collections of nerves in their arms that help to control them. And so one of the things that I just love about this is this idea of what would it be like to be an octopus? Would you feel like your arms did a little bit of moving without you? But even that is a very human way of looking at it, to think if you're an octopus, your perception must be all in your head. And therefore if your arms move on their own, it feels like they're not moving as part of you. But that's probably not what it's like. If you're an octopus, your perception, your actual sense of self, whatever that means, would quite likely be distributed throughout your body.
Right, because they don't have...
And so what does that even mean?
Yeah, like they don't have one like central computer where like this is all kind of owned by this. You know, this is me. It's like...
There's a lot more interplay. I was just going to say, in the skin as well, like the skin of an octopus or a cuttlefish or squid has a lot of nerves in it. And we don't completely know how much of the amazing camouflage and color changing they do is totally controlled by their brain, the central nervous system, and how much of it is sort of coordinated just within the skin.
I mean, you call ganglia. Is that what you call them?
Yes, yeah. Because a ganglion is singular and ganglia is plural, and it's just a collection of nerves. And so our brain is a great big ganglion, but it's fancy.
So that's still just as complex as like a sort of mush brain that we would picture a brain to be. It's equal to it. It's not just like...
Well, a ganglion contains more. That's not the right way to put it. I should say that there are more things that you can call a ganglion than there are things that you can call a brain.
Okay.
So the things, the things that are in the head region of a lot of worms are not, I think many of the people who study them would say they're not really brains, they're ganglia. They're a central... And also ganglia can exist throughout the body in a less centralized way than a brain. It's a little bit fuzzy, I think, the edges of those definitions.
I was wondering, like, then does it kind of maybe make you think that whatever's going on in their tentacles and arms is not quite, like, it's inferior to what may be going on in their head?
It's certainly different, because what is going on in one arm that has some autonomy in it is not going to be sort of centrally processed the same way as what's going on in the lobes in their head that are taking in sensory information from the eyes, from the skin, from other things, and there's more central processing there. And what would be going on in a ganglion in the arm wouldn't have as much input. It wouldn't be taking in all of that information. It would be more of a localized decision-making process, I guess.
Right, yeah. So it is just, it controls, and it's sort of like, the door is at where the tentacle ends. It's responsible for that, its own
Yes,
bit.
Yeah. But then, like, how much does that tentacle communicate with what's going on in the central? Like, that's still very open. I don't think anybody completely knows yet what that is like. It's so cool. It's so cool.
It's so cool. I mean, so when I was a kid, I wanted to ask you this, because when I was a kid, I used to just think, I'd watch, like, space programs and, like, cartoons and stuff, and I would think any life that we find is going to be so completely different to what we have here. Like, we can't even begin to imagine. Like, we have everything that is life on Earth came from one single ancestor, we think, right? And, there's this process of consumption, reproduction, and a constant transfer of energy. That is what life is.
Yeah.
And it seems like that's what we're looking for, which makes sense. But when...
It's all we know.
Yeah. I kind of wondered, like, with you looking back, 500 million years and trying to understand this form of life, and obviously being so very familiar with our own, there are definitely similarities that we share with cephalopods that we also share with this one single life mama that landed on Earth, or who knows. But does it make you think that that is life, that there are these general rules to life and the whole of the universe must follow these rules? Or do you think that there could be something out there that's like, I don't even know, like my brain would pop?
That's I love it. Such a good question, because I too was always fascinated by aliens.
Right.
I've always read tons of science fiction, both like total pulp and hard science fiction, and I loved aliens. I would like make up my own aliens when I was a kid. I love that stuff. And I think that your question is such a good one, and to me it really parallels that question of intelligence, of like, so we think of intelligence as something that humans have, and then we're looking to see if non-human animals have it. And then that forces us to say, but what is it? And how would you know? And you say, well, an octopus can solve a puzzle. An octopus plays. An octopus has the ability to change its behavior based on what it can learn, is learning intelligence. And so it sort of pulls it apart. And I think that can be really interesting. And I have a feeling that life is kind of like that. Like we know what life is because it's something we have on our planet. And then we're looking for it other places. And then that makes us say, well, what would it mean to have life if we found some planet that had units of silica that reproduced and spread over the planet? Would we say, and I'm not a geologist, so I'm sure like people are already rolling their eyes that I even uttered that phrase. But my point is, like, I could imagine us seeing things and then arguing, is that a mineral phenomenon or is that life? Because it isn't made of the chemicals that we see as life, but if it's reproducing, if it's, say it's building structures, we'd be like, is that life?
Yeah,
do we have to be able to communicate it with in some way?
Right,
I don't know. And I think absolutely, I think that there's got to be lots of interesting things out there. It's a gigantic universe. Whether we'll find any of them is one thing. I don't know.
And if we find it,
if we ever will, but I think it's great that people keep looking.
Would we recognize it?
if we find them, what will we recognize them as? Will there be a whole debate of just trying to describe what we've found, and then there will be people who say it's clearly life because it reproduces or because it consumes. Because I think one of the earliest signatures of life on our Earth is the early bacteria that produced oxygen. There was very, very little oxygen on Earth before life started producing it. And it completely changed the planet. And I love a number of writers and artists have made this point, that it was the first pollution. And it was terrible pollution because oxygen is a really reactive compound. And it's actually really bad for you. And it like does all of this bad stuff. And life ever since then has had to cope with oxygen and all of the things that it can do to you. And you're like, well, they ruined the Earth, but then they learned how to deal with it. So that's what.
Yeah, new life formed in that space, right? It was life that could, and that's exactly what will happen if we keep changing and polluting our atmosphere now. Is just whatever life really enjoys, lots of carbon and like crazy wild wet weathers, and that life will win, and life that likes it the way that it is now will not survive.
It's going to have a hard time.
It's just always...
Right. Now we depend on oxygen, but the only reason it's here is because those early cyanobacteria totally messed things up. But it's great. It's great. Yeah. So I think I got away from your question a little bit, but I think that sort of thing is what we'll find if we find anything. Things that make us really question what life is.
Yeah. Yeah. That'll be fun. That'll be a really exciting time.
Yes.
What do you think sort of is in store for cephalopods as the climate does change? I mean, how are they? Are they endangered in the same way that a lot of land creatures are, and a lot of other sea life is?
Some of them are. So we already know there are big groups of marine animals that are at risk. Some scientists think that coral reefs, as we know them, just won't be able to survive. We've already lost so much. It's hard to imagine what we think of as a coral reef really making it through the changes that are already being predicted. And that sort of loss is a lot to do with the combination of temperature changing in the ocean, rising temperatures, and acidification, which is what happens as the carbon dioxide interacts with the chemistry of the ocean and everything gets more acidic. And those things, the temperature and the acidity, then are also influenced by changing oxygen in the water, which is related to both of them because the amount of oxygen that water can hold depends on its temperature. It depends on how much oxygen is being used up by other organisms. And so there are very little oxygen that have been growing. So the reason I went through all of those is that they all affect cephalopods. Of course, they affect everything that lives in the ocean. And many, many cephalopods seem to be a lot more resilient to those changes than something like a coral is, which is encouraging for those of us who like cephalopods. And partly it's because of most of them not having much of a shell. So shell-building animals really struggle with ocean acidification. Most cephalopods have no shell or a minimal shell, exactly. And so they're not nearly as much at risk because of that. There are the nautiluses, the chambered nautiluses that build these big, beautiful shells. And I wish sometimes that I had one to show people, but I also am kind of glad that I don't, because the biggest risk, chambered nautiluses are listed as endangered now, and it's not because of vacation. It's because people collect their shells too much. There was too much of a global demand for those gorgeous shells, and so people started fishing them more and more out of the ocean. So I'm actually kind of glad that I don't have one, because then I can talk about why I don't have one, because it's not great to try to collect them, because there just aren't enough for everybody to have them. Fossils, on the other hand, are generally pretty easy to get your hands on and probably not going to hurt anything, so it's good.
For real? Well, like what? You just sort of
because ammonites especially are so abundant. So abundant. So there's certainly, like, depending on where where are you again?
In London. I don't think there'll be many here.
Well, not in London, but you can go to the seashore, right? Sort of. I mean, you're not that far away. So if you go to the cliffs all around England, they're full of fossils.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Yeah, just crammed. Like, do you know where lime
They're made
is?
of
Lime ridges?
old
Yeah.
sea life, right?
Exactly. The chalk itself is nothing but
Yeah,
compressed fossils. And then within that, you have tons of ammonites. And one of the... Right, when you can travel, if you can travel, where I would go if I were you is to Lyme Regis to see the place where Mary Anning, who is one of the most famous paleontologists, dug up the famous ichthyosaur skeletons that are now in the museum that were like some of the earliest giant reptiles to be discovered. And she found tons of ammonites. She sold them to tourists for money because she was working class, so that was how she made a living.
I've heard of her. I think she's in one of our museums here, probably the Natural History Museum.
Yeah, she would be.
Oh, that is so cool. Okay.
Yeah. Anyway, I got very off topic. Sorry, but I love Mary Anning, and so I always try to work her in.
We love her.
She's very, very cool. So anyway, better to collect fossils than to collect nautilus shells. Nautiluses are now listed as endangered. That only happened pretty recently. So that's actually quite good because it means that a lot of people are more aware now of why you maybe shouldn't buy a nautilus shell and working towards figuring out if there is a sustainable way to harvest them and working with the fishers in the areas where they live. But they're also, they haven't really yet demonstrated any impacts of ocean acidification. And I think partly that's because they grow really slowly. They're one of the only cephalopods left that actually has a really slow life cycle. And so we just don't know that much about them in terms of climate change impacts or anything else. And a lot of people are working on that. But the other cephalopods, the ones that don't have shells, are facing some other risks from temperature changing. There are certain species, especially deep sea species, that may be at risk as deep sea mining spreads, because a lot of deep sea species are also a little bit slower growing. A lot of them have fewer babies, which makes them at a little bit more risk if a population gets decimated by mining coming through. But as a general rule, so far, I am optimistic for the future of cephalopods in a changing world.
And earlier you said that they will pretty much eat anything, so they can kind of adapt to whatever happens to the food webs as well.
Right. They're generalist predators, most of them. And so they don't eat great big things because they do have, even the giant squid has a fairly small beak. Its beak is about the size of my hand, which is okay, terrifying, like to have a whole beak that's the size of my hand. But when you consider that it belongs to an animal that's almost as long as a school bus, you're like, okay, it's not, it's no great white shark. It can't swallow a big chunk of a seal. And so even the big ones are eating fish. They're eating fish that are a few feet long, maybe. They eat other squid. They love to eat other squid. Squid are delicious, and squid don't judge, so they just eat themselves. Not literally themselves, but they definitely eat other members of their species all the time.
That's crazy.
Yeah, constantly. They're totally cannibals. And that
is crazy.
And they eat crabs, and they eat dead stuff, and they eat just really whatever they can cram in there.
Wow. Because there are, cephalopods is quite a wide net here, right? There's a lot of species that sort of come under that.
Yeah.
How many do you think it is? Or how many is it? We know how many it is, right?
How many? We know how many we have named. There are probably going to turn out to be more species.
Do you know how many have been alive? Could you guesstimate how many are extinct?
Ooh. Yes, probably. Well, I think what we're talking in, I couldn't really quickly look up the numbers. This is why I write, so that I have time to write things down and look them up, and then I forget when I'm doing a talk to memorize things. But it's in the
You're
hundreds.
a very good writer.
Thank you. I appreciate it. A little bit better at that.
Okay.
But yeah, it would be somewhere in the hundreds as far as we know. But there's always going to be more species, which is quite cool, really. But yeah, the diversity of even just modern ones that are still alive is there's giant squid, of course. There's teeny tiny little squid, pygmy squid that are mature at about the size of your fingernail. They're so cute. There's super deep, there's octopuses that have been found just 7 kilometers deep. underwater. There's really shallow ones. There's Argonaut octopuses, which my next project is about Argonaut octopuses, which are the only octopus that still makes a shell. And they, instead of growing it inside their body the way a squid grows its reduced shell or something, they actually spin it out of their arms, almost like a spider web or something. And it's completely different to what all other cephalopods do. And it's totally crazy. And they make these beautiful, very thin shells that are coiled, and they use them to raise their babies in. And that's just one of the other cephalopods that just do that.
The variety of life is just so cool.
They're great.
I mean, it really makes you think about certain things, like with the skin changing color. Like, so there's a reptile, the chameleon, that famously does that, right? And it's like how much of a gap in like relatedness there is between those two species and a group species and one species, and yet they both do it. And it's like, how does life keep coming back to these things, but on all of these different pathways? It's like, whoa.
Yes. Oh, I think it's really, really interesting. Yeah. And in some ways, it's the similarities that are most remarkable. When you look at an octopus's eye and a human eye, this is the comparison, I think. So their eyes are very similar to ours. They have a lens. They have retina, they're image-forming eyes that evolved totally differently. Like our common ancestor did not have eyes. And you can tell, you're sort of tempted to be like, did they just steal our eyes at some point? Did that just take our eyes? But you can tell that they evolved on a different trajectory when you look at them really closely, because they have the way that their eye is built is different. Their nerves come out. So if you think of this as sort of an eyeball, and like this is where the light would come in on this wrist, and then this is where your retina is that collects the light and gets the image. A cephalopod has nerves coming out of the back of that bring the information to the brain. Somewhere off screen over here is a brain.
Okay.
But
because it's not as close.
It's off a little bit. It's pretty close. I'm just stretching things out a little bit. But in a human eye and any other vertebrate eye, it's actually backwards. The nerves come out this side, and then they have to come out through a hole to go to the brain. Oh. So the eye is, even though it does the same thing, it has the same parts, it's built in a totally different way. And our eyes are arguably worse, because that fact of all of the sort of backwards nerves means there's a little blind spot that all vertebrates have in our eyes, where the nerves come out and go back to the brain.
I mean, it's like two people who didn't know each other at all and were lived on opposite sides of the world, both designed a car at the same time, but they built it out of like plastic and one built it out of metal. But and one oh my, even though they live at the bottom of the ocean in some places and they have to deal with water and darkness, it still works the same way.
Pretty much. Yeah, there's some other slight differences, but and I love your example of the car too, because I feel like that kind of thing actually does happen. I don't know that it happens specifically with cars, but the same idea or the same invention will sometimes happen in human history in totally different locations. Or like in the history of biological science, one of the most famous examples is that we remember Charles Darwin for coming up with the idea of evolution by natural selection. But a completely different scientist named Alfred Wallace came up with the same idea at almost the same time. And he ended up corresponding with Darwin, and they wrote to each other about it, but only after they had each come up with this idea on their own. And so it's an amazing thing that can happen.
It kind of makes me think of going back to the question we had about, is there sort of general rules for how things will turn out, or are there? Is that just coincidence, or is it just because Earth is one tiny little piece and the universe is this huge, and so obviously there are going to be these kind of similarities here, but like, hey, don't even think about it. Wow. There's one more question I really wanted to ask you that I find that I get some really like amazing answers out of this. So if you had $500,000 to spend on getting any question about cephalopods that you have inside answered, how would you spend it? What would you want to find out first?
That is a really good question. Oh, I love that.
And I know you've already
asked
said
that.
like 5 different things that you really, really want to know. But is there anything?
Oh gosh, yeah. Let's see. One that we haven't talked about yet, and so therefore I will use this as an excuse to talk about it.
Yes.
Is their social behavior and their communication with each other, and their arguably presence of language, because this is something that is really interesting to me. There are squid who use their color changing skin to communicate with each other. And that's known that both squid and cuttlefish do this. We know some of the patterns they use. A lot of it is around mating, so that they're communicating to each other their availability to mate, their interest or their suitability as a parent of potential offspring. They're communicating aggression to rivals. But there's more than that we see that we don't know what it means. There's lots of examples, people being in the water with animals or getting video of them flashing different color patterns to each other that we just have no idea what they mean. And octopuses, so that's squid and cuttlefish, we know they do that. Octopuses tend to be solitary. They tend to live by themselves. They're often very cannibalistic, and so that they're kind of protecting themselves by living at a distance. And so we don't know very much about them communicating with each other. And yet, just kind of within recent years, maybe the last 10 or 20 years, people have found more examples of social octopuses. There's a sort of octopus city off the coast of Australia called Octopolis that has gotten some attention that people have been writing about, where they live in this, in a fairly small area. A large number of octopuses live, and they've lived there for generations. And they do seem to have social interactions, and they seem to communicate with each other. What it means, what they're saying, we're still in the dark. But another octopus city like that has also been discovered in, they called it Octatlantis, I think, and I don't remember where it is.
I love
and then
these
at the
names.
same time, they're great. They're hilarious names. And then at the same time, there are some species. There's a striped octopus species in the tropical Pacific that actually seems to stay with mates and raise offspring together in a way that nobody really thought that octopuses did. And so there's more social interaction in octopuses than we thought. And we don't know what all the social interaction in squid and cuttlefish means. And I would love to just I think you would need more than money. I think you would need a lot of time as well to throw it. And to what extent can they sort of build interactions and build societies? I don't know. Would you call it that? What does their language mean? And there's so many different species, and a lot of them have for this yet. So could you kind of expand the number of species you're looking at to try to generalize for it?
So these octopus cities, are they just one species that lives together, or is it just like
they're members of a single species. Yeah.
Right. But is it a kind of across a lot of different species they have these same?
Not yet. So far, it's really just been a few species that people have found this sort of thing in. But then every now and then something new gets added. Like fairly recently, there was video, because we're exploring the deep sea more. People are just sort of independently, there were some adventurous rich folks who decided to just go to the deepest point in all of the oceans recently, which was great, because then they took a bunch of cool video and samples and pictures, and then there's scientific expeditions constantly sending down robots or landers with video, and one of these brought back images of a whole group of mother octopuses in the deep sea brooding their eggs in proximity to each other. So it's on the one hand, it's easy to read a whole
Like-
bunch into that. Like, oh, it's a nursery.
Like a mamas and toddlers group.
Exactly, it's a mama toddler. It's a nursery. And then on the other hand, it's easy to try to just be very like, it's completely environmental. They're just all there because the temperature must be right and the water conditions are right, and they're not having any interactions with each other because we haven't seen it. And who knows what's really happening? I'd love to know.
That is something that it seems like it's just scratching the surface just now, and it's like we're not even really sure. Like, we've just got a few snippets, a few bits of evidence of it happening, and then it's like, oh, this suggests. I mean, yeah, like we've been saying, in 10, 20, 50 years, there's going to be entire school, university labs dedicated to these questions, right? Because, whoa, there's so much there.
Yeah.
I would love the idea of a really complex language, something a little bit like bird song.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
You know? Danna, you've blown my mind. Thank you so much for this.
You're very welcome. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm really glad. You enjoy talking about them day after day after day.
I never get tired of it. Yeah, there's always something new.
That's so great.
Yeah.
I'm so
happy. So as I... if you don't mind, I that reminded me that I wanted to mention that because I never ever get tired of cephalopods, I just keep working on them. So I have the book coming out on September 15th. That's Monarchs of the Sea. That's all about the evolutionary history. And then next year I have a book coming out that's a biography of this is the Argonaut project that I was talking about, those octopuses that spin their own shells. So what I'm actually writing is a biography of the female scientist in the 1800s who discovered it. She's the one who figured out that they make their own shells using their arms, and how they do it and why they do it. And so I'm really excited about that. Her name is Jeanne. She's a French scientist, and so the book is called Jeanne and the Argonauts, sort of a play on Jason and the Argonauts.
Yes, I love it. Oh, well, can we talk again next year then? We can talk
I would love that. That would be fantastic.
Everything, everything that's moved on since then with this. Oh, thank you for sharing that.
Oh my gosh, I'd love that.
This has been great start to your day.
Yes.
Great end to mine.
That's true. Have a good night. It has been a wonderful start to my day.